there. Sorry about that. We are in Exodus chapter 2, and I will catch you up as we get into it. Exodus chapter 2, there are four main divisions, as you can see behind me. The first is rescued. We'll see how this baby boy was rescued. And then we will see running from Egypt. We'll see that baby boy grow and end up having to run away from Egypt for some reason. We'll get to that. Third section is Reformation begins. We see that that baby boy grows into a man and begins to be changed by God. And then fourthly, as you can see, is recognizing the problem. And that's a small section, parenthesis. It is obviously very much involved and related. We'll get to those. But let's go ahead and pick it up at verse 1 as we get into our section called Rescued. And a man of the house of Levi went and took as wife a daughter of Levi. Okay, now that sounds really creepy. These would have been distant relatives from the same family, from the same tribe of Levi. Okay, but this man and this woman get married. And in verse 2, so the woman conceived and bore a son. Now, stop there for just a moment. I want you to put yourself in their place for just a moment. You have this man and woman who we found out in chapter 1 they're slaves because they're Hebrews. All of the Hebrews had been enslaved in Egypt. The Pharaoh at that time imagined that they were a threat to him and actually enslaved them. And we had actually been told in chapter 1 that this Pharaoh who's ruling at this time didn't know about Joseph. So some of us, we went through the study together through Genesis, and we ended looking at Joseph and all of the wonderful work that God did through him in Egypt. Well, this Pharaoh didn't know anything about Joseph, didn't care, is the point. Now you might think, well, how is that even possible? It is believed that what we're reading right now took place about 300 years after the death of Joseph. After Joseph had passed, Jacob's family had passed. The Hebrews have multiplied. There are lots of them there in Egypt. And the Pharaoh is intimidated by their numbers and begins to imagine that they are a threat to him. And actually, what he does is that he threatens to kill all of the newborn Hebrew male babies, so that they obviously can't grow and reproduce, is his point, or so that they can't revolt against him. So what we're reading here, I want you to understand something. I want you to put yourself in the place of this man and this woman. We don't know their names yet. We'll get their names later on. But in the midst of all of that madness, their entire world was filled with wickedness and evil. They were slaves. They were actually slaves in Egypt. And yet, even in the midst of all of that madness, these two love each other and are willing not only to get married, but to have children. And they actually have a couple of children that are already a little bit older than this. But here in verse 2 we read, so the woman conceived and bore a son. And so in the midst of all of this madness and slavery, they decide to continue having children. Now, here's the point that I want to make. There are many of us who spend our lives, we invest our lives in doing all that we can to avail ourselves of danger. We do all that we can. We spend money and time and resources trying to make our lives as comfortable and trouble-free as possible. And you can be a Christian and live that way. You can be a Christian and live that way, and you'll go to heaven, and you'll have your place in eternity. But I want you to understand something here about this couple. In the midst of being slaves, and as their families are threatened and placed in danger, yet they decide to continue having children. Now, there are two thoughts on that. Number one is they're reckless, careless. They ought not to have been having children because those children are being threatened. But I want you to understand this, that if these two parents, if these two people were not daring enough to continue having children, this little baby boy, who I'm sure most of you know already, and if you don't, spoiler alert, here comes the answer. If you don't know this yet, this little baby boy is going to be Moses, the deliverer of Israel from the Hebrews, the Israelites, from Egypt. And so had they not given birth to this baby boy, could God have gone a different route and used someone else? Yes, he absolutely could have. But this was the route that God was choosing to take. And because these people were willing to put their own safety and well-being out on a limb, God was able to use them in an incredible way. I cannot imagine for a moment that they ever thought there's this little baby boy, this son that they were having, was going to lead the people out of all of the slaves, the Hebrew slaves, out of Egypt, out of captivity. But as they pressed forward in faith, they were used mightily by God. And what an incredible thought. Now, what an incredible encouragement and challenge for you and I. As we seek to live our lives danger-free, seeking to do all that we can to stay within our comfort zone, we are challenged, at least I hope that we are, at this point with this verse, that these two were willing by faith to continue having children. Let me ask you a question. What is the meaning of your life? What is the purpose of your life? What does your life consist of? Does it consist of just on your way to heaven and trying to be as worry-free as you can and trying to be as safe as you can? And hey, I'm going to get to heaven, and who cares if anybody else goes, as long as my family goes? Or are you one of those individuals like the parents of Moses who perhaps were thinking, hey, I don't want to just survive, I want to thrive. And I don't want this current condition that we are in, this slavery that we are in, to dictate my life to the point, and they, no doubt their lives were dictated for them. But in this point, they said, hey, we're going to continue pressing forward. And they press forward by faith, and there are some of us who have something stirring quietly within our hearts. But it's getting louder day by day. And it is that desire in your heart to want to do more, to do something, to be involved in something bigger than yourself, to allow God to use you in some incredible, mind-blowing way. Well, it requires faith. It requires that you and I go out on a limb. It requires that you and I may be placed in danger, although surrounded by His safety. It means that you and I seek to not just survive, but to thrive. To submit our plans and our dreams to God and to allow Him to have His way with those things. This woman and this man have a son, and we see here, first of all, remember that let me go ahead and get there. Sorry about that. I get all excited and forget. We're in the section called rescued, and we see here, first of all, that this child is rescued by his mother's fear. So the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. Now, she didn't hide him simply because he was a beautiful child, who was it that I saw some some celebrity the other day just recently released some, a couple of rare photos of her son. You know, it's not like, oh, he's such a beautiful child, and we're so famous and well known that we can't let anybody see him. It's not that type of thing. The male children were being threatened; their lives were being threatened, and so she hides this baby for 3 months. So actually, through her fear, this baby is rescued for the first time. However, this baby is rescued a second time. Look at verse 3 and 4. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him. So she took a vessel and daubed it with asphalt and pitch. In other words, she made it waterproof. Put the child in it and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Now this is a slightly comical for me. Not what she did, but in the way that the movies and the animated movies and cartoons portray this, because they seeking to communicate the danger of this, and certainly it was dangerous to put your baby in a basket and set them in the water would be very dangerous. But what they do is you'll see that the mom, sneaks out there and puts the basket in the water, and that she shoves it off into the water, and man, I mean that river just, it turns into the Grand Rapids or something, and you just see the basket all over the place, and crocodiles trying to get at it and all this craziness, and it finally settles in this place. But that's not the case at all. She put the baby in the water, but put the baby in the reeds. She knew exactly where that baby was. And then what she did was, she sent his older sister along. Hey, go watch the baby and tell me what happens. So in verse 4, it says, and his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. So not only was he rescued by fear, but he was also rescued by his mother's faith, his parents' faith. As they believed that God must have a plan, and they put that baby in the water, taking a chance, and put him out there to see what would happen. And so we find out here in verses 5 through 10, that the baby was not only rescued by fear, rescued by faith, but rescued by Pharaoh's daughter. Look at this in verse 5. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. Now, some people believe that she may have actually known that Pharaoh's daughter would come down to that area all of the time to bathe. Whether that's true or not, I do not know. But we're told here that the Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe at the river. And her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Now, quite an amazing story. The Pharaoh's daughter comes out to bathe in the river. And as she comes out, she's hanging out, and she sees the basket off in the distance. And she tells one of her maids, one of her servants, hey, bring me that. And so on cue, as Pharaoh's daughter opens the basket, on cue, that little baby boy begins to cry. And her heart is stirred with compassion. And you ladies, you know how it goes, right? You see a little baby boy, little baby girl, little newborn, and you just do the, aww, so cute. You're immediately smitten by that baby. And Pharaoh's daughter was smitten by this little baby. Now, I want you to keep something in mind as we go through this. There are some fantastic, and I mean that in every sense of the word, some fantastic things that are happening here, some miraculous things that are happening. I want you to understand that this is what we call the providence of God. It is God's protection, his divine protection over his people and over situations specifically. And we definitely are seeing the providence of God here in directing this baby's life, in directing his mother, in directing the sister, in directing Pharaoh's daughter even. And so what happens here? Pharaoh's daughter says, hey, bring me that baby. She's absolutely smitten and had compassion on him in verse 6. But she recognizes right away, this is one of the Hebrews' children. In verse 7, then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? So, how convenient. The older sister's there, and she comes running up and say, oh, hey, Pharaoh's daughter, you've got a new baby. And would you like me to go find one of the Hebrew nurses to nurse this baby? Obviously, for obvious reasons, Pharaoh's daughter was not able to. So in verse 8, and Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the maiden went and called the child's mother. So here's what happened. In case you're like, wait a minute, did that really just happen? This mother has a child. She hides the child for as long as she can, and then, knowing that she can't hide the child forever, she puts the child in a basket and sets him in the reeds in the water next to the river's edge. And then she sends his older sister, go and follow, go watch from afar and see what happens. Keep watch over it. And Pharaoh's daughter comes out, sees the basket, and falls in love with that child immediately. The child's sister, older sister, comes and says, hey, Pharaoh's daughter, I see you've got a new baby. Would you like me to find a Hebrew nurse for you to nurse this baby for you? Pharaoh's daughter says, yeah, do it. So this little girl goes and calls her own mother, who also is the mother of this little baby boy. And she comes, okay, and I want you to see what happens here. Verse 9, then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. So in other words, the mom had the baby, precious little baby boy, surrenders the baby boy to the river, and then eventually gets her baby back and has the opportunity to not only nurse him, but to raise him. More importantly, to raise him. Now, I don't know exactly how long she raised him for. I imagine that it wasn't that long, probably until he was weaned. Okay? We're not told there how long it was. But Pharaoh's daughter certainly would have wanted this baby back as soon as possible. She loved this baby. She had compassion on him. So he then goes from his mother's arms to the river, to the arms of Pharaoh's daughter, and then back to his mother's arms to be nursed and raised. And now he's going to be given back to Pharaoh's daughter to become part of the royal family. And that's where I mentioned a moment ago the providence of God in directing all of this, divine protection and direction. It says in verse 10, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moshe, or Moses, drawn out, saying, because I drew him out of the water. So Pharaoh's daughter actually names the baby Moses. Now there's an incredible lesson here for you and I. It's not one of our main points, so I'll mention it and then we'll move on as quickly as I can. And that is this, that I opened up by talking about these parents who were daring. They were dangerous. They had a daring faith. I want you to see what this mother does. And it's not just the mother, it's the parents together. But they are willing to take their precious baby boy. And I believe they had faith and they trusted God and they put their baby out there. In other words, by putting their baby into this basket and out into the water, they were, in a sense, surrendering their baby and the safety of their child and their baby to God, believing that God had a purpose for this baby. Their faith was daring, no doubt. But listen, let me ask you a question. Is there something that you are holding on to so tightly? So tightly that you will not even allow God to pry your fingers open to have at those dreams or those plans that you have? Is there something that you're holding on to so tightly that you are actually choking it out? Do you have dreams, desires, plans that you want to accomplish, that you want to see come true, but you're actually gripping them so tightly that you're cheating yourself? You see, when you and I are willing to give the things that are dearest to us to God, oftentimes we will see, when we surrender those things, we will see those things returned to us at some point in the future. We can see that when we submit things to God, that God can take those plans that we have. And we have huge plans. We've been told that. You guys have been told that for a long time. Big, dream big. But I've got news for you, and the news is this: that God can cause those dreams to become a reality in an incredibly larger way, a much bigger way than what you had planned. You may have plans and desires that are too small, and God may have something grander in view. And so let's be willing to submit the things that are dearest to us to God, and to trust Him with those things, to see if He would use them, to see if He would take them for His own purposes. She does that, and she is rewarded. So this baby was rescued by fear, his mother's fear for his own life. He was rescued by his mother's faith in putting him in the water, trusting God. But he was also rescued from the water and from death by Pharaoh's daughter. The providence of God. Let's move on. Running from Egypt. Verse 11, now it came to pass in those days, when Moses was grown, that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So evidently Moses knew that even though he was part of the royal family, he must have known, his mom probably taught him, that he was actually a Hebrew. And he had not forgotten that. And he's out making his rounds, and he's visiting the Hebrew slaves. He's looking over. Now remember, he's an Egyptian as far as everyone knows. And he's out looking at the plight and the hard lives of the Hebrews. Perhaps thinking, man, I could have been raised that way. I might be a slave today. But understanding that he's got this privilege of living in the royal palace with the royal family. And so as he goes out, he sees this Egyptian beating a Hebrew. And it says in verse 12, so he looked this way and that way. And when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. We're about to find out why he was running. I mean, we see it there, obviously. I'll go ahead and put it up. This is our one point in this section, and it is murder. Moses has just committed murder. Now, take that in for just a moment. This man is to be the leader of God's people and lead them out of captivity, out of Egypt. And he's to lead them toward the promised land. That's the original plan. And yet this man becomes a murderer. He murders. Now take note that as he was about to do it, he stopped and he looked this way and he looked that way. You see, if we had those details, this individual and these details in a court of law, we might be able to charge him with premeditated. It wasn't just a fit of anger and he jumped on the guy and killed him. He actually thought about it for a moment. He looked this way, looked that way, and then he got the guy. He wanted to make sure that he wasn't going to be caught. He kills this Egyptian and buries him in the sand. Now, what about the Hebrew that was being attacked by the Egyptian? I don't know. Did he stay there and see the whole thing? Did he see Moses and the Egyptian fighting? Did he see Moses kill the man and bury him in the sand? We really don't know. It doesn't say. It doesn't give us those details. But let's find out what happens here. So, in verse 13, and when he went out the second day, so Moses, after murdering a man, he goes on about his business. And the next day he comes back out. And it says, behold, in verse 13, 2 Hebrew men were fighting. And he said to the one who did the wrong, why are you striking your companion? Look what this guy says in verse 14. Then he said, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? So Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. Now, how did that Hebrew know that it was Moses that had killed the Egyptian the day before? Is it possible that this Hebrew that is involved in this Hebrew on Hebrew fight is the guy from before, the day before? I mean, maybe he's a troublemaker and he's getting mixed up in all these fights. We don't know. Or did that Hebrew go and tell everybody, hey, you wouldn't believe what happened. Pharaoh's son, or Pharaoh's daughter's son, so in other words, Pharaoh's grandson, came and saved me. There was an Egyptian ready to kill me. And he showed up and he killed the Egyptian. We don't know exactly how this Hebrew found out, but on the second day, one of those Hebrews says, hey, what are you going to do? You're gonna kill me too and bury me in the sand like you did the Egyptian? And at that point, Moses realized that he was found out. And so it says at the end of verse 14, so Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. People know about this. And in verse 15, when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So Moses runs from Egypt because he's guilty. This is not, he's guilty of murder. It's not because he was wrongly accused. No, it's because he is a murderer. Do you understand that? That's something that you and I need to keep in mind as we go through the book of Exodus, because God, as many of you know, God is going to use Moses to do some incredible things. But we need to keep in mind that Moses was a murderer. And yet God still, in his infinite grace, in his multitude of tender mercies, was able to use this man whose life has just, within a verse or two, has become an absolute mess. He's had to flee his own home from both of his moms. He is a fugitive. He's a murderer. And now he's in Midian by himself. And it will be interesting for us to see how all of this plays out and how God can use someone like this. How God can use someone like this. Now, we're going to get into it in a moment. But how can God use somebody that was a murderer? We'll find out here. And so it says this, he at the end of verse 15, we find Moses, he's in Midian, and he sat down by a well. Let's get into our third section, which is Reformation begins. Now, when I say Reformation, some of you may immediately think back to, I forgot his name again. Martin Luther. I keep wanting to say St. Augustine. Martin Luther, some of you may flash to, Martin Luther, Reformation. Well, what I'm talking about here is the reformation of a man. In other words, the reforming of an individual. Verse 16, now the priest of Midian, remember, Moses is in Midian sitting next to a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. You see where this is going, right? Moses runs away. He's in Midian, sitting next to a well. The next thing it mentions is what? Oh, the priest of Midian. We know God's involved. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters. And it's like, oh, come on. We know where this is going. And they came and drew water. So these 7 daughters, they actually show up to this well. And, you know, you may be thinking that they were like out there in, you know, some cute little robes, all, you know, like clean and, you know, sweet smelling and, you know, whatever, had just, you know, just coming from the shop or the nail salon, getting their nail did, you know, whatever it might be. But they show up, and we find this out in verse 16. And they came and drew water, and they filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Shepherdesses. The priest of Midian has 7 daughters. I've got 3 daughters. 3 daughters. Matt, who's sitting in here, has got 3 daughters. I don't want to start a bunch of trouble. I'll just say this. Some of you already know what I'm talking about, what I'm about to say. When I say it, you're going to be like, yeah, there's no lie. Drama. Okay? 7 daughters. Can you imagine 7 daughters? I was in here first. I'm trying to use the mirror. I'm in the bathroom. You know, hey, that's my brush. You can't use my brush. You know, my soap. I'm telling you, you know, I've heard all of these things, okay, for years. I grew up with a mom and 2 sisters. And now I've got a wife and I've got 3 girls. You know, who left this and why'd you do this and who used my whatever it is. And you go into the bathroom and there's just, I don't understand. Like, why are there 18 brushes? I don't get it. And why are there so many? I once in a while I'll go take a shower in the front. We've got 2 bathrooms, and once in a while I'll go in the front bathroom, and it's just like I get in there and then I'm like, man, like I don't. What is all of this stuff? Like all I need to do is wash my hair and scrub my body, and it's like there's like 23 different shampoos in there. And conditioners to go with every single one of them, and there's facial scrubs and scrubs for my ears and cuticle this and that, and I mean I don't, and that's just 3 girls. Can you imagine 7 daughters? So this priest of Midian has 7 daughters, and they show up and they're actually shepherdesses, and they're drawing water and they're putting it in the troughs that were there in order to water their flocks. Who's also there? Moses, right? Who's there, right? Moses. And it says here, here's what happened in verse 17. Then the shepherds came. So these were men that showed up with their flocks. Then the shepherds came and drove them away. So, ladies, you know how guys are, right? You're in the bathroom trying to do your hair, trying to get yourself all made up, doing it just right, and what happens? Your brother comes barging in. I gotta use the bathroom, you know, all stinky, sweaty, because he was outside, you know, climbing on something or playing football or whatever he was doing. He just comes barging in, pushing you out of the way. I gotta go to the bathroom, get out. Same type of thing. These guys just come in. They see a bunch of ladies there. They're like, get out of the way. And they just barge right in and push them out of the way and actually drive the ladies' flocks out of the way. And it says that the shepherds came and drove them away because they wanted to water their own flocks. But what happened? Verse 17, here it is. Charlton Heston, all tall, big and buff, Hollywood man, just stands up and takes charge, right? Here's Moses. But Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. Now, there's something here that I must mention. I love this attribute, this characteristic of Moses. I believe that it was put in his heart by God. And it ought to be, this attribute, this characteristic ought to be evident in my life and in your life. And it is this. Moses, we have seen, has a love of freedom and justice. When he was in Egypt, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, mistreating a Hebrew. And he stepped in and took action. Now, he went about it the wrong way. That is the truth. He ought not to have resorted to violence that way, but he did. But we see still the hunger, the desire for justice. He wanted the Hebrew to be treated fairly. And then the next day we see it again. When he sees 2 Hebrews fighting, and he shows up and he says, he gets in between and says, hey, relax. You know, why are you 2 fighting? And of course they turned on him and said, hey, well, what are you going to do? You're going to kill me too? But again, justice. fairness, freedom. He wants people to be able to live in freedom. And now he's at this well, and these 7 daughters show up. And then the other shepherds come in and drive them out of the way. Moses sees that, realizes, hey, that's not fair. And he stands up once again and he helps the ladies. It's a desire for justice. And Moses is one of these individuals that's willing to take his stand, to make his stand and say, hey, that's not fair. And he calls it out. And so you and I ought to be doing the same thing. We ought to be willing to stand up on behalf of those that are weaker, that can't stand up for themselves. Whoever it might be. Do you understand? There seems to be no apparent distinction in the heart of Moses. Yeah, the first time he killed an Egyptian that was beating a Hebrew. The next day, he told the 2 Hebrews, hey, knock it off. But now, he's in the land of the Midianites. It does not seem to change him. He doesn't look at them and say, oh, they're just dirty Midianite women, who cares? But he stands up for these women. And he makes his stand against the oppressors. And I like that. You know, that justice and freedom, these are things that we get from God. These are things that we see in the heart of God. That God is just. God is fair. And we ought to have those things evident in our own lives. And we ought to be praying for God to help us to stand for justice, to make our stand, regardless of the color of someone's skin, regardless of their gender. Listen to me, church. Regardless of what gender they may claim to be. We may not like it. We may say, well, that's not, it's only male and female, and you think you're such and such, and so I don't like you, and I'm against you, and so I'm not going to defend you. That is wrong. That is wrong. We ought to be willing to stand for justice on behalf of anyone, regardless. We may disagree with them. We may disagree with their religious beliefs, their political beliefs. But that doesn't mean that it's okay for people to be mistreated. And Moses does not seem to care who it is that's being mistreated. He's one of these individuals that's willing to stand up. I like this. I wonder if he didn't learn this from his mom, who was willing in her faith, by faith, her daring faith, to put her own baby out there. I wonder if she passed on that thought, that mindset to her own son. Hey, be daring, son. And see what these people are doing is not right. It's wrong. And we ought to be willing to say something. I don't know. I know that ultimately it came from God. And I like it. And I think I need to be more like this. So, what happens is in verse 18, when they came to Reuel, their father, so these 7 young ladies, they come back to their dad, Reuel. We get his name there, Reuel. He said, how is it that you have come so soon today? How did you water the flock so quickly today and get back home? And they said, an Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds. Now, keep in mind that Moses had just come from Egypt. I mean, he's fresh off the trail, okay? And, he must have, obviously he looked like an Egyptian. They didn't know that he was a Hebrew. It probably was because he was walking like an Egyptian. He was probably walking like this. Was it the Bengals that sang that walk like an Egyptian? It was probably because he came walking into town like this. That's probably what it was. And they had seen the hieroglyphics or whatever. They knew, Egyptians walk like that. That's probably what it was. It may have been because of his haircut, because of his dress. So those are the things that I assume. He obviously didn't look like a Hebrew. He was different. Probably clean shaven. Whatever it was. But they assumed that it was an Egyptian. And it says here in verse 19, and they said, an Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and he also drew enough water for us and watered the flock. And in verse 20, so he said to his daughters, and where is he? Why is it that you have left the man? Call him that he may eat bread. Bring that boy over here. We need to feed this guy. He saved my daughters. I'm going to give him something. I'm going to reward him. I'm going to give him something to eat. And in verse 21, see, the priest of Midian, this Ruel, he's a guy. He knows how guys think. Hey, you saved my daughters. Come on over. I'm going to give you some food. You know how guys are, right? Oh, food, give me some pizza. I'll do anything, Verses 21 and 22, this is where we get our one point in this. Verses 21 and 22, then Moses was content to live with the man. Now, you talk about cutting the story short. Look at this. He goes in verse 20 with, call him that he may eat bread. Bring him over for supper. To verse 21, he's living with the dude. And he gave Zipporah, his daughter, to Moses. So now we see him sometime later, sometime in the future, he actually is living with the priest of Midian and has married Zipporah, one of the priests, one of Reuel's daughters. And in verse 22, and she bore him a son. He called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a foreign land. Now I want you to keep in mind that the name of this section is Reformation Begins. And he's got a family, and maybe you're thinking like, well, I don't really get it. We're talking about, well, listen, let me share something with you. When God wants to use an individual, he will take an individual, break an individual in order to make an individual. That is how God works in our lives, and that's how he worked in the life of Moses. He takes Moses, and here is the breaking of Moses. And you go, well, what do you mean the breaking of Moses? Well, Moses in his younger days he was quite the wild man. You probably gathered that. It was within him to attack and kill an Egyptian, which he did. And then the next day he goes out and he stands between these two Hebrews that are ready to fight. And then he flees Egypt and flees to Midian. And when he gets there, he's willing to stand up on behalf of these ladies against these shepherds. And so he's that type of an individual. He's, boom, we're going to, sin and justice is going to make it happen. But now we see, we begin to see the settling down of Moses. It's God's reformation or reforming process. He is reforming Moses because God is taking a man and breaking a man because he's in the process of making a man. He's taking a potential leader, breaking a potential leader in order to make a leader. And so that's what we see here. We see that we get the picture that Moses is beginning to settle down now with the family. And then finally, our last section, verses 23 through 25, is recognizing the problem. And this is related. It seems to be a bit of a parenthesis, but it is related. I'll explain. Now, it happened in the process of time in verse 23 that the king of Egypt died. So another king, gone. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out. And their cry came up to God because of the bondage. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. So he recognized the problem. The problem was their bondage, but the point being that he recognized. Did you know that? Verse 23, their cry came up to God. Verse 24, God heard their groaning. Verse 24, God remembered his covenant. Verse 25, God looked upon the children of Israel. And in verse 25, God acknowledged them. 5 times. It's pointed out to us that God was aware. He acknowledged the problem, and the problem was bondage. And God is hard at work with a solution. I want you to keep in mind that the children of Israel had been in bondage for some time, slavery. And no doubt they had been crying out to God for a while. And in their minds, God had not rescued them from slavery yet. And there are those times in our lives when you and I are praying for something and we're not seeing a rescue or a resolution from God, not hearing an answer. I want you to see we get a behind-the-scenes look on the way God answers prayer. That God is taking the time to take a man and break a man in order to make a man. That God is in the process of answering their prayer. They had been praying. God is in the process of answering their prayer. Do you see that? I hope you see that. Because that is an encouragement to you and I. That when you and I begin to pray, God begins to answer. But oftentimes He's got a plan. Not oftentimes, He's always got a plan and a process. And there are those times when God will answer immediately. But the overwhelming majority of the time, God answers after a process. He's busy working all of the angles, working everything all at once, so that all things work together for good to those who are called. So let that encourage you today. Don't give up on whatever it is that you're praying for, whatever rescue you are hoping for, whatever solution you're praying to God for. Whatever answer it is that you are seeking from Him, continue to trust Him and allow Him the time to finish the process. At just the right time, He will raise this man up to use to free His people from Egypt, from captivity, from slavery. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for tonight, or for today, and how we desire your will. But oftentimes our fear can hinder us from submitting to your will. We formulate a plan, and instead of submitting that plan to you, we hold on to that plan ourselves, and we seek to work that plan out in our own timing, in our own will, in our own strength. But how foolish is that? When you and your plan are so much bigger. And so won't you help us in this area to be willing to let things go, to open our hand in submission to you, and to let you have whatever it is that we're holding on to so tightly. May you take those things and formulate your plan. We dream big, but you dream so much bigger, Lord. And so help us, please, to realize that this afternoon. We thank you. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Don't forget, this coming Wednesday night, we begin in-person services once again. We will be in the book of Romans, chapter 3 that night, and then we'll be back in in-person service next Sunday, and we will continue that way. So we're looking forward to seeing you. If you are still uncomfortable about joining us, or parents are saying you can't, make sure you send us a DM, send us a message, so that we'll know whether or not to keep the Instagram live going, okay? It's been a blast. We love you guys. Hope to see you real soon. Bye.